Hello dear friends, I welcome you to this, a video beginning with a hiss. I wish that hiss would morph into a mew, but no, alas, she does not want to do. I feed her, yet she never pays me rent. I love her, yet my time is often spent receiving bites that I do not deserve. I nurse my scratches, oh, the outright nerve! And yet, my love for her can never tire. No matter how she fills me up with ire, her little paws and stupid wide-eyed stare cure all my ills and stifle my despair. My mouse, I'll love thee past our parting day. With care and heart, this sonnet can't convey. Welcome! This video is about sonnets, one of the most, if not the most, enduring poetic forms there is. And that was my sonnet, written for mouse and for this video. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting it's a good sonnet, I am not a sonneteer, and will absolutely be looking at some wonderful sonnets by real poets very shortly. But my sonnet does provide examples of some of the key structural sonnet writing poetic devices that it's important to be aware of. Firstly, simply, sonnets have 14 lines, which mine does. Secondly, there's a preconception that, traditionally, sonnets are written to express or grapple with feelings of love, which mine does, though this is a very interesting topic that is significantly more complex than sonnets are about love, and we'll be exploring that in a bit more detail soon. Thirdly, for no real reason, I chose to write the entire thing in couplets, which is one way of doing things. It's often called a couplet sonnet, sometimes referred to as a Clare sonnet, after the English poet John Clare, who wrote lots of them. So, we've got a rhyme scheme of AA, BB, CC, DD, EE, FF, GG. Next, I also managed to write most of it in iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is a phrase we all probably remember from school, but it's worth dissecting exactly what it means here. So an iamb is a metrical foot that contains an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Penta means 5. So if a line is written in iambic pentameter, it means that it contains a total of 10 syllables that follow the unstressed stressed pattern. Dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. Hello, dear friends, I welcome you to this. Shakespeare used iambic pentameter in his sonnets and his plays. The rhythm is pleasing, musical, it rises. It's considered to mimic the natural rhythm of human speech. An iambic metre is the opposite of a trochaic metre, which contains a metrical foot that goes stressed, unstressed. Now, there's a lot of debate about this issue, which I welcome you to sleuth out for yourselves, but you could argue that if iambic metre mimics the ease of natural speech, trochaic metre must feel unnatural, perhaps grating or unsettling. A famous example of a poem that utilises the trochee to create an unsettling atmosphere is Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting, still is sitting. These lines, like most of the poem, are written in trochaic tetrameter, so each line contains a total of 8 syllables, that's 4 metrical feet. And notice how the stressed, unstressed rhythm creates a falling quality, perhaps more appropriate for a mournful, spooky poem like The Raven. Now, The Raven isn't a sonnet, so I won't be going into any more detail about it here. But you can see how, if you're perhaps writing a sonnet to convey feelings of love, the rising, uplifting rhythm of iambic pentameter is more appropriate than the unsettling fall of the trochee. The next thing to note is my sonnet has a volta, which is Italian for turn. The volta is important because it indicates a change in the sonnet, where the speaker's train of thought takes a turn of some kind. In mine it comes at line 9, so the first 8 lines, or the octave, are a lament to Mouse's aggression and refusal to pay rent. Then the final 6, the sestet, are, but I love her anyway. And having the turn here, having the rebuttal to the initial argument or the narrative set out in the sonnet come just after the octave like this, it's actually the Petrarchan way of doing things, and we'll get to that in a moment. So things we've learned so far. Sonnets have 14 lines. We've touched on the idea of rhyming couplets and iambic pentameter. We've addressed the concept that sonnets are traditionally a kind of love poem. And we know that a sonnet typically includes a volta, or turn. But where do all these traditions, rules, and formal expectations come from? And, most intriguingly, can sonnet writers deviate from them? And how? The sonnet, or little song, originated, we believe, in the 13th century. There are 3 traditional sonnet forms that are widely recognised today, and they are the Italian, or Petrarchan sonnet, the Spenserian sonnet, and the Shakespearean sonnet. Each of these forms is named after a poet. Francesco Petrarca, often referred to by the anglicised version of his name Petrarch, who lived during the 1300s, Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare, both born in the mid-1500s. And these three forms differ in terms of rhyme scheme and structure. So traditionally, the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet consists of an octave with the rhyme scheme A, B, B, A, B, B, A, followed by a sestet that typically rhymes CD, 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 or CDE, CDE. The volta also typically comes after the octave, like in my sonnet. The Spenserian sonnet follows the rhyme scheme AB, AB, BC, BC, CD, CD, EE, and it's often considered a midway point between the Petrarchan and Shakespearean sonnets. And then, of course, we have the Shakespearean sonnet, or the English sonnet, used by Shakespeare, though he didn't invent it, as we might assume. Packed with iambic pentameter, the Shakespearean sonnet typically consists of 3 quatrains, that's 3 4-line stanzas, and a rhyming couplet, and it follows the rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Let's dive in and have a look at a Shakespearean sonnet we're all familiar with, Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Some time too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair some time declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So what do we notice? Right away, there's the iambic pentameter. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? The rhythm is easeful, it's flowing, it's musical to the ear, it mimics the natural, seemingly effortless love the poet-speaker feels. So we've got the love poem vibes, and we've also got the Shakespearean rhyme scheme. Now, the volta comes after the octave here, which is more typical of the Petrarchan sonnet form, as I've mentioned, and it's indicated by the but, after which the poem shifts from a discourse on the trappings of mortality to a promise of immortality. And true to form, Sonnet 18 concludes with the famous rhyming couplet, a key feature of the Shakespearean sonnet form. It's that couplet that interests me when reading this sonnet. Superficially, this ending follows the love poem theme. I've written a poem about you and therefore you'll live forever. Oh. But what else does this tell us? You could also read this final assertion as the poet-speaker's very self-confident assessment of his sonnet writing. As long as people are alive and reading, they'll be reading my sonnet, which immortalises you. The poet-speaker is assuming that his work will stand the test of time, and of course, he's right, we're absolutely still reading it over 400 years later. So there's more depth to the sonnet than the seemingly straightforward idea that the poet-speaker is professing love to his subject. In the sonnet's powerful final lines, emphasised by the rhyming couplet, Shakespeare is drawing attention to his own literary prowess. More than this, if we read that couplet again, taking into account the context of the preceding lines, we can see why this sonnet is so enduringly popular. I'm thinking about that word growest. In these eternal lines, the sonnet's subject, that's the person the sonnet's addressed to, will grow. They're not simply being preserved as they are, the idea of growth infers change. While the poet-speaker is in the process of immortalising his subject, he's doing more than that. After all, if immortalisation was the only goal, he could just detail facts about his subject, give them a name, for example. But he doesn't. Instead, the sonnet's subject has the potential to grow and change throughout time, and they're therefore not so much being preserved as much as they're being offered up for reinterpretation. And that's what makes the sonnet so popular and enduring. We can impart our own interpretations, readings, experiences of love and desires onto the subject. They become ours as the lines pass down the generations. This isn't just a love poem, it's something far more complex. And this complexity persists throughout Shakespeare's 154 sonnets, a sequence of poems extremely interested in love, but also in ideas of mortality, writing, reputation, procreation, infidelity, immortality, and sex. Sometimes they're unsettling and strange, and you could even argue that Sonnet 18 has a potentially sinister undertone. Consider the line, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. That fair thou owest. If we take fair here to mean the subject's beauty, owest implies that their beauty is owed. To whom? Who does the subject owe their beauty to? A weird concept in itself. To understand this line, let's delve into a bit of context about the publication of Shakespeare's sonnets and their thematic divisions. Shakespeare's sonnets were written in the 1590s, when sonnet writing was very much in vogue, though they weren't published until 1609. We don't know if Shakespeare authorised their publication or oversaw their organisation into the sequence we have today, but that's all we really have to go off. So, according to the sonnet sequence as we have it, sonnets 1 through 126 seem to be written to a beautiful young man, while most of the remaining sonnets are addressed to the so-called dark lady. Shakespeare didn't name his subjects. As such, there's a lot of speculation as to who the young man and dark lady are. I have no particular horse in that race. More power to those who sleuth for clues, but I don't really think we can ever be sure. Now, Sonnet 18 is written to the beautiful young man, and one of the reasons it's noteworthy is because it's the first in the sequence so far that doesn't explicitly focus on the young man's duty to procreate. The first 17 sonnets are often referred to as the procreation sonnets, in which the poet-speaker urges the young man to preserve his beauty by having children. So Sonnet 18 doesn't explicitly tell the subject to procreate, but the poet-speaker does suggest the subject owes the world his beauty. And if we run with this interpretation and consider it in the context of the preceding 17 sonnets, you could argue that there's something very creepy about the poet-speaker's adoration. It's insistent and moves beyond the realm of a straightforward compliment or a proclamation of love into something invasive and possessive. So we can see how Shakespeare isn't simply starry-eyed with love. These sonnets don't read to me as a straight-up narrative of affection. These aren't blind I love yous. There's creepy procreation stuff going on too, as well as a not-so-small helping of self-aggrandizement. But you might be thinking, hang on a minute. If even Shakespeare, the sonnet writer we've all heard of, isn't the big proponent of the idea that sonnets equal love poems, then who was? Let's roll back the clock a couple of hundred years from Shakespeare and visit Petrarch, the poet who is, indeed, often recognised for popularising the association between sonnets and love. Petrarch wrote hundreds of love sonnets to a woman named Laura, whom he loved and lost when she died during the Black Death in 1348. But you could make a strong case that, like Shakespeare centuries later, Petrarch, while he may well have loved Laura passionately, is more interested in demonstrating his poetic prowess than he is in simply expressing his love. According to Catherine Bates, Petrarch famously turned his love for Laura into a mechanism for producing stunning verse, punning on her name so as to turn her into the lauro or laurel, the signifier of poetic fame and success that he could win for himself, even if he could not realistically hope to win her. Identifying with Apollo, the sun god and patron of poetry, who pursued Daphne only to be left with the laurel or bay tree into which she was metamorphosed, Petrarch presents himself not only as a crowned laureate poet, but also as the implicitly godlike producer of golden or aureate verse. He also punned Laura into lauro, gold. So he may well have loved her, but Laura is also a very convenient connection to laurel, and by extension to laureate, like poet laureate, symbols and titles akin to poetic stardom. You could argue then that the praise he seems to heap onto Laura wasn't really so much directed towards her as it was self-praise, designed to reflect back flatteringly on the poet himself. So the reality of Laura is tentative. Petrarch puns on her name to align himself with poetic glory and victory. Like Shakespeare centuries later, there's the sense that these sonnets are not so much devotions of love to a subject, to a person, than they are a medium through which to practice, display, and immortalise the poet's skill. The lesson here, then, as I like to see it, is never rest on tradition. It's easy to think, well, all sonnets do this, or all sonnets contain this theme, and it's especially easy to assume that older, canonical sonnets will definitely work within the restrictions and confines we like to impose upon them. But even when we feel we've got a sonnet all worked out, it's probably breaking a rule or two. As Don Patterson writes, a great sonnet will often surprise you by doing at least one thing it's not supposed to do. Taking this further, a really interesting idea put forward by Catherine Bates is that sonnets weren't really about love to begin with. They have always been, about something you might consider love-adjacent, desire. However passionately the speaking voice might insist that he aches for his beloved, Bates writes, however urgently he might call on her name, however devoutly he might wish for or earnestly beseech her, the one thing he does not want, or not yet, is for her to actually materialise, to come down from her pedestal, or to acquiesce in his demands. The sonnet doesn't work if you obtain your subject. If you win your love's affections, if you're content, you don't have a sonnet, is the idea. Sonnet writers came up with plenty of inventive ways to keep their beloved subjects at arm's length. Sometimes they were married to someone else, sometimes dead, sometimes ethereal beings or muses. You could maybe argue that in Shakespeare's case with the young man, the subject is kept away because of his gender. So the beloved, the Laura, the young man, the dark lady, in spite of whether they really lived or not, become poetic devices themselves. This, in turn, you could argue, means that the sonnet never really gets anywhere. The writer will never win their sweetheart's affections, for example, because that's not really what they're trying to do. The sonnet and the sonnet sequence functions as a testament to the writing's self and the endless and fruitless pursuit that is chasing the very concept of desire. In popularising this way of writing, Petrarch sets an example that is imitated by countless sonnet writers throughout history. Indeed, the whole "you'll die, but you'll live on in my writing" Sonnet 18 vibes are all inherited from Petrarch's appropriation of the form. But you could also read this constant chasing of desire and need to prove oneself as a poet as something less than a pillar of success, and more as a desperate cry that highlights the futility of poetry, writing, love, maybe even life. Bates draws on recent re-evaluations of Petrarch that have come to see his poetry as less the product of a master poet, a dazzling monument finished and achieved, and more as the product of a self-divided and self-alienated subject, of a self internally split and so eternally in crisis. Think of the punning on Laura. As Bates writes, meaning emerges from absence and difference, and is endlessly displaced from one word to the next in an endless chain of signifiers. Laura, Lauro, Lauro. The result is that any final meaning or signified is infinitely deferred, and any hope of achieving such a thing effectively disappears in a puff of air, or Laura, leaving no one in control of their meaning or with mastery over their words, least of all the writer. So you might simplify all this down to something like, sonnets are not simply about love because love is not simple. And this opens up all kinds of questions, like how much crossover is there between love and desire? What do we do to feelings of love when we put them in a sonnet? Does the form itself carry so much weight that it automatically alters the feeling itself? As love is complex, so is the sonnet form. And therefore, every time a poet writes a sonnet, they can't help but buy into the traditions that precede them, while implicitly fitting the form to their own desire. Let's move away from love and desire in the romantic sense and have a look at a sonnet written in the romantic sense. We'll be turning once more to my main man, John Keats, whose 1817 sonnet on Seeing the Elgin Marbles is about illness and death, rather than lustful desire and passionate love. You'll see how, though it's very different to Shakespeare, and it isn't addressed to an object of affection, there's no Laura here, Keats is absolutely caught up in that pesky mortality-immortality conundrum that we see in Sonnet 18. As Andrew Bennett writes, each of Keats's major poems may be read as centred around a moment of bodily failure, of mortal fading. On Seeing the Elgin Marbles is an expression of illness and decay, both in terms of language and structure. My spirit is too weak. Mortality weighs heavily on me like unwilling sleep, and each imagined pinnacle and steep of godlike hardship tells me I must die, like a sick eagle looking at the sky. Yet 'tis a gentle luxury to weep that I have not the cloudy winds to keep fresh for the opening of the morning's eye. Such dim-conceived glories of the brain bring round the heart an undescribable feud. So do these wonders a most dizzy pain that mingles Grecian grandeur with the rude wastings of old time, with a billowy mane, a sun, a shadow of a magnitude. A series of cloying, elongated syllables weigh down the sonnet's opening lines, made all the more cumbersome by the dash and line break that work to emphasise mortality, the burden of human experience that invites illness and wasting. The sonnet's expression of mortal decay persists, if not intensifies, until the poet-speaker is left in a most dizzy pain. You could also argue that the Volta arrives early on in the sonnet at line 6, and that this is one of the structural inconsistencies that works to mimic the sickness and confusion of the poet-speaker's language and the decay of the marbles. Oh, the Elgin Marbles, by the way, are marble statues that used to adorn the ancient Greek Parthenon in Athens, and were stolen by the British in the early 1800s, and they still reside in the British Museum today. Keats's mercurial blend of iambic and trochaic pentameters emphasises the dual breakdown of the marbles and the poet-speaker's health. So he's got the jarring trochees amidst the musical iambs. This variation in metre doesn't follow an obvious pattern. It seems haphazard, as though the poet-speaker is stumbling at each line, affected physically and mentally by the slow wearing of decay. The sonnet concludes with a series of caesuras that demonstrate the breakdown of stability. The Grecian grandeur of the marbles is subject to the rude wasting of old time, and elemental damage like the billowy mane of the sea, a reference to the marbles being shipped to England from Greece, and the sun. As Grant F. Scott puts it, the sonnet appears to waste away, ending in a series of half-articulated images. It crumbles, and is at last held up only by a scaffolding of makeshift dashes. Like the marbles, the poet-speaker will be subject to the effects of time and decay, reduced inevitably to a shadow of a magnitude. This final phrase suggests the ruination of something formerly great. Removed from the grandeur of their classical contexts, the marbles can only ever be a shadow of what they once were. However, the word magnitude doesn't exclusively indicate something positive, does it? Keats doesn't give this magnitude a distinct shape or size. So all that's known about the shadow it produces is that it's present and incalculably large. It's a shadow not dissimilar to death, the formless immensity that dogs the poet-speaker throughout the sonnet. Sickness, decay, and dying form the present experience of the poem, and it's within this experience that the poet-speaker remains. Keats is an inheritor of Shakespeare's sonnet writing, but in terms of structure, rhyme scheme, theme, he makes it entirely his own. Lastly, we're going to have a look at a significantly more contemporary sonnet, The Rights of Cousin Vit by Gwendolyn Brooks, first published in Brooks's collection Annie Allen in 1949, that would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1950. Carried her unprotesting out the door, kicked back the casket stand, but it can't hold her, that stuff and satin aiming to enfold her, the lid's contrition nor the bolts before. Oh, too much. Too much. Even now, surmise she rises in the sunshine. There she goes, back to the bars she knew, and the repose in love rooms and the things in people's eyes. Too vital and too squeaking, must emerge. Even now she does the snake hips with a hiss, slops the bad wine across her shantung, talks of pregnancy, guitars and bridge work, walks in parks or alleyways, comes happily on the verge of happiness, happily hysterics, is. The more I read this, the more powerful I feel it gets. You'll notice some adherence to those traditional sonnety regulations. Brooks writes in 14 lines, she uses a rhyme scheme that's a kind of Petrarchan modification. There's love in the sonnet, and there's some iambic pentameter in there, though you'll notice Brooks actually writes in 10 and 11 syllable lines. That's where I think the adherence ends. As Hadara Barnadav puts it, The Rights for Cousin Vit is a dynamic and innovative Italian sonnet that beats against its formal cage, as an elegy with a punk rock spirit, and as a love poem written by a woman to another woman in a celebration of friendship. So this is a poem about the death of Cousin Vit, and it celebrates her life, which makes it an elegy, as Barnadav suggests. Now, this is definitely not the place to get into a big discourse about the elegy and the tropes and poetic devices typical of the elegiac form. Suffice to say that, broadly speaking, an elegy is a poetic lament for a dead subject. But it's Cousin Vit's aliveness that really comes across in this sonnet, her irrepressible presence, a presence we'll soon encounter. As soon as we begin reading, we're immediately in the action, mid-action no less, with the carried her unprotesting out the door. We don't know exactly who is doing the carrying, nor who kicked back the casket stand in the next line. It could be us. The lack of the possessive I or my shocks us into personally partaking in this ritual of grief. But grieving in a traditional sorrowful sense is quickly undercut by what you might argue is a volta, way up early on in the sonnet in line 2, but it can't hold her. So any sense of lament that we're taking part in a traditional funerary arrangement is quickly lambasted by the idea that Vit cannot be contained, not by the stuff and satin, not by the lid's contrition, nor the bolts before. I love this line. There's something so musically pleasing about it to me, and I love how it seems to reject straight-laced, westernised funeral norms. The coffin's lid, is contrite, i.e. remorseful or penitent, and it's trying to wave it down and impart those constraining feelings on her, but it won't hold her in. It can't hold her in. There's something almost gloriously gory in this rejection of norms surrounding death, like Vit's coffin can't be closed, she's too much for it. And we get that refrain of too much in the next line, as though the poet-speaker is overwhelmed by the death of Vit, but also with how much life there is yet in her subject. We get an echo of this too much, in the wonderfully divided line, too vital and too squeaking, must emerge. Vital plays on the name Vit and her powerful vitality, and that must emerge. As Barnardave says, Brooks captures the aliveness of Cousin Vit via ruptured syntax. And I think that's right here. We've got a two-word sentence that cuts into any sense of flowing rhythm the sonnet might have espoused, and that reads almost like a frustrated note, like jotting down the bare essentials of what needs to happen. Must emerge. And Vit does seem to emerge. If at first we're invited to surmise, to imagine that even now surmise she rises in the sunshine, a few lines later, and we're not really surmising anymore, we've got that even now again. She says, even now she does the snake hips with a hiss. But there's no suggestion that we're imagining her presence anymore. She's here, with us, in the explosive present of the poem. She returns to old bars and former lovers, does things that might well be considered controversial and seedy, certainly in 1950s America. There's a sense that she drinks to excess, talks with vigour, reminisces about music and motherhood. And ultimately, living as she did and does, Vit comes happily on the verge of happiness. Happily hysterics. Is. Let's spend some time with these last lines. Now, happily is an archaic word that means by chance. So maybe Vit finds the verge of happiness by chance, and she finds hysterics, a heavily feminised word that I think Brooks is reclaiming here, by chance. So there's a sense of spontaneity in everything Vit does. Then we've got to address this idea as well that she's only ever found the verge of happiness and not happiness itself. But whether you read this as a final, sorrowful assertion that Vit was nor ever will be happy, or that she's come close and is now headed in the right direction towards happiness, we feel how her life is full of chance and wonder, passion and sunshine. As Jill M. Parrott argues, the narrator demands that readers focus our attention on how, even in death, she rises, she acts, and she has agency. Further, she rises in the light, not the dark. And from this emergence into the light, finally, Vit is. That one syllable, one word conclusion, it distills Vit down to her presence. She is. What we have here, as Parrott puts it, complete sentence power. This two-letter utterance set aside represents her very being. It's a monument to her existence and a testament to her humanity and vitality, as her name suggests. Now, not all critics read this ending as empowering, but I think I'm inclined to agree with the idea that it's just breathtakingly punchy and powerful. Vit is here. And it also reminds me of that feeling that comes with grief, of being totally overwhelmed and not being able to do anything and having to just be passive, to just be. Grief just is. It's such a captivating ending because it says everything, but also contains such momentum that it points towards the ineffectualness of language. Vit is, and that contains everything about her, but equally, we relearn the lesson we've been learning throughout the sonnet. She can't be contained. Not even by language. Certainly not by the sonnet. So, 3 very different sonnets from 3 very disparate time periods with starkly distinct cultural resonances and implications that each take the sonnet form and all its rules and tropes and turn it into something completely unique. If you're looking for top tips on how to read sonnets or a watertight list of features to check off in your analysis, I can't help you. As I've pointed out, there are some consistencies. But what I hope to have demonstrated is that the sonnet is kind of amorphous. It can't really be hemmed in by one official set of rules because poets will always take it and remake it to suit their own beliefs, ideas, and purposes. So what I would recommend when it comes to studying a sonnet is take it for what it is. She agrees. Be aware of the history and structure and all that, but don't expect to find it, and don't judge it based on those preconceived standards. See if and how it resonates with you, how it makes you feel, and don't shy away from the unexpected. I want to close with a quote from contemporary sonnet writer Jacqueline Safra. The sonnet is a form which paradoxically, and because of its very dependability, never does what you expect. Infinitely malleable, infinitely musical, that 14-line distilled shot of pure poetry is a gift. Free, beautiful, and limitless in possibility. Thank you for watching. I've been Rosie, this has been Mouse. I hope you like sonnets, read more of them. If you have a favourite sonnet already, please let me know in the comments below. And if this is your first time reading sonnets, which one did you like best? If you enjoyed this video, a like would be much appreciated, and feel free to subscribe. And with that, I'll see you in the next video. Let's roll back the clock a couple of hundred years. Let's roll back the clock a couple of hundred. Sorry, I'm still laughing.